The beginning of everything began when a group of my college buddies and I made the decision to go on a camping trip to the isolated woods of northern Minnesota. For many months, Jace, Liam, Nora and I had been making preparations for our vacation. We were particularly anxious to get away from the pressures of university life and spend time in the great outdoors. Unbeknownst to us, our journey would eventually develop into a terrifying experience that we would never forget. We arrived at the campground in the late afternoon, just as the sun was about to set beyond the horizon where we were camping. While we were putting up our tents and gathering firewood, there was an uncomfortable silence that pervaded the atmosphere. It seemed as if the tall pines were leaning in, with their branches making a cracking sound like old bones. "Does anyone else feel like we're being watched?" Inquiring with a small tremor in her voice, Nora questioned. Jace managed to laugh it off. "It only depends on your imagination. In the midst of nothing, we find ourselves." On the other hand, as the night became darker and we crowded together around the campfire that was flickering, odd things started to take place. While barely discernible, the whispers that reverberated through the woods were clearly human. At the periphery of our field of view, shadows dazzled us. "Did you hear that?" With his eyes wide open, Liam snarled. We became quiet as we made every effort to listen. The mutterings became more audible as they encircled our tent, like animals following their prey. My skin was prickled with goosebumps when a cool wind blew through the high temperatures of July. An unsettling cry pierced the darkness of the night all of a sudden. The color left Nora's cheeks as she got to her feet and sprang to her feet. It sounded just about right, way too near. With trembling hands, we reached for our flashlights and made our way into the forest, where we hollered for the person or thing that was causing the scream. Unfortunately, the forest was able to stifle our screams, and the darkness was approaching from all directions. The whispers became more intense, eventually blending together to form a frantic chant in a language that we were unable to comprehend. After then, we were able to see it. Among the woods, there was a person that stuck out with a twisted and strange appearance. In the light of the moon, its skin seemed as pale as bone, and it wore faded rags. The head of the apparition, which had sunken black pits in its eyes, suddenly jerked towards us. Branches were tearing at our faces as we sprinted into the foliage, slamming wildly through the undergrowth. There was a sound of pursuit becoming closer with each breathless breath, and the murmurs that were coming from behind us changed into shrieks of laughter. Through some means, we were able to return to the encampment. Without even pausing to get our belongings, we crammed ourselves into Jace's vehicle. Something collided with the side of the car as we were traveling at a high rate of speed down the gravel road. During the scream that Nora let out, a gnarled hand scraped against her glass, leaving jagged lines behind with its fingers. Over the course of the night, we traveled without turning around to look back. Despite the fact that our hearts were still beating rapidly, we did not ultimately come to a halt at a gas station until the morning broke. When we staggered inside, untidy and scared, the residents gave us strange stares while we were inside. At the desk, an elderly guy strained his eyes to look at us. "You folks been up in the Whispering Woods? How? How did you know it was a stutter?" The man gave a head shake. "The history of those woodlands is a disturbing one. Up there, people are reported missing. Some people believe that the trees are alive, and that they entice people to come in and never let them to leave. Despite our want to hear more, we did not remain. We left town and did not return for a long time. My dreams are still plagued by the whispering, however. I am certain that I am able to hear them sometimes, beckoning me to return to those dreaded forests." I had no idea what we came upon on that particular evening. Perhaps it was a spirit of vengeance, or perhaps it was an old evil that chooses to make the forest its home. The only thing I am aware of is that we narrowly avoided losing our lives. I also hope that no one else will make the same mistake that I did and camp in the woods where the whispering is. Story 2. When I made the decision to go on an excursion with several companions to investigate the abandoned Fairhaven Asylum, we thought it would be an exciting experience. Due to the fact that we were amateur ghost hunters, we were always looking for the next big shock. On the other hand, nothing could have adequately prepared us for the awful things that were waiting for us behind those collapsing walls. A notorious reputation was associated with the facility. The facility had been closed down in the 1970s due to allegations of mistreatment of patients and unexplained disappearances. There was a rumor going about that the souls of the patients who had been mistreated continued to linger, their tormented souls being imprisoned inside the deteriorating hallways. We arrived to the institution on a cool evening in October, as the sun was sinking behind the trees that had become overgrown. As our company got closer to the gates that were rusty, a feeling of worry began to spread within us. The air had a weighty sensation and seemed to be charged with an energy that was not visible. My buddy Mia looked at Zach with a shaking voice and questioned, "Are you sure about this, Zach?" In an effort to conceal my own nervousness, I pushed myself to smile. "This is going to be a lot of fun. We have our cameras and EMF scanners at our disposal. First, let's try if we can get a glimpse of any supernatural occurrences." As we made our way inside, the musty and gloomy interior was revealed to us thanks to the cracking sound of the ancient wooden doors. There was graffiti all over the walls, and there was rubbish all over the floor. I felt a shiver go down my spine while we were doing the setup of our equipment. We had the impression that we were being observed. An abrupt and deafening thump reverberated throughout the facility. We froze on the spot, our hearts racing. "What was that?" Mia only murmured. "It's probably just the wind," I responded, attempting to convey an air of self-assurance. On the other hand, I had a feeling that something was awry. Strange occurrences started to take place as we proceeded farther inside the residential facility. In the corners of our eyes, shadows flickered, and murmurs reverberated throughout the rooms that were completely vacant. Our electromagnetic field EMF readings increased, which is indicative of a powerful presence of the supernatural. Next, we were aware of the screaming. They seemed to be far away at first, as the thick walls masked their voices. However, as we continued to follow the sound, they became more loud and urgent. It seemed as if someone was being subjected to torture. At the conclusion of a lengthy corridor, we arrived at a room. There was a flickering light coming out from inside the door, which was slightly ajar. Despite my hands shaking, I managed to force it open. What we witnessed inside will leave an indelible mark on my mind. An agonized person was restrained to a table made of corroded metal, and its body was distorted in pain. It was surrounded by spectral medical professionals, all of whom were displaying a sadistic joy on their faces as they carried out horrific deeds. In a terrified expression, the creature turned its head in our direction and looked at us. It mumbled, "Help me," in a voice that was less than human. The institution was filled with the sound of our cries as we hurried away. However, regardless of how quickly we went, the screams of pain followed us and were more audible with each step that we took. We had the impression that the walls were closing in on us, enclosing us in a nightmare from which we had no way out. In the end, we rushed out of the facility, struggling to catch our breath. In spite of the fact that our bodies were shivering with anxiety, we continued to run until we reached our vehicle. After that night, we never discussed what we had seen. However, the memories continued to torment us. The institution had shown for us the actual extent of human brutality, the evil that may continue to exist long after a person has passed away. In the event that someone hears this account, I strongly advise them to avoid going to Fairhaven Asylum. There are certain locations that are designed to be left alone, with their mysteries deep inside the past. Because if you have the courage to go inside, you can end up becoming a part of its dreadful past. Story 3. Antiques, particularly ones with a troubled past, have always been something that has captivated my interest. As a result, when I happened across an antique picture at an estate auction, I immediately knew that I wanted to acquire it. An image of a lady wearing a black dress was shown in the artwork, with shadows filling up her face. She exuded a sense of melancholy that appeared to emanate from the canvas, and there was something eerie about her. Despite the fact that his hands were shaking, the vendor, who was an older guy, seemed anxious to get rid of the picture. He said, "Take it," in a voice that was scarcely audible above a whisper. "But be warned, it carries a curse." I took his comments with a chuckle, assuming that they were nothing more than a superstitious story designed to push up the price. The artwork was something I was delighted to add to my collection, so I brought it home with me and gave him a few crumpled dollars. The initial impression was that everything was okay. My living room is where I hung the artwork, and I couldn't help but admire its spooky beauty. Nevertheless, as the days went by, weird occurrences started to take place. The first thing I heard were murmurs, which were barely audible on the periphery of my mind. It was during the middle of the night that I would awaken, sure that someone was calling my name. On the other hand, I was there when I switched on the lights. Following that, the nightmares started. Suddenly, I would find myself ensnared in a gloomy and unending nothingness, with the lady depicted in the picture reaching out to me with chilled and lifeless hands. My bedding would be saturated in perspiration when I had to wake up screaming. Attempting to persuade myself that it was simply my imagination, I attempted to convince myself that the picture was not really cursed. On the other hand, I had a feeling that something was awry. One evening, while I was sitting in front of the television, I saw a movement in the periphery of my vision. After turning around, I saw the lady shown in the picture standing at the doorway, her black dress flapping in the wind as if there were a breeze not there. She looked at me with eyes that were dead and empty, and you could see a twisted grin on her lips. After a moment, she was no longer there. However, the uneasiness continued to be a knot in the pit of my stomach, which was horrible. From that point on, the eerie sensation became more intense. Without any apparent cause, doors banged shut and objects moved about on their own. I would see the lady everywhere, her face poking out of windows and mirrors. I would see her everywhere. I was aware that I needed to get rid of the artwork, but each time I attempted to do so, I was thwarted by something. I had the impression that I was being held captive by an unseen power that was connected to the cursed artwork. In the end, I was unable to stand it any longer. I made the decision to give the painting my whole attention. Although my heart was racing in my chest, I stood in front of it. "What do you want from me?" I demanded, my voice trembling slightly. It seemed as if the woman's face was flickering and her features were transforming into a horrible mask of wrath. As she growled, her voice sounded like the rustling of dead leaves. "Your soul," she said. My thoughts were racing as I lurched backward. I understood that in order to free myself from the painting's influence, I needed to destroy it. I reached into the kitchen and got a knife, and then I rushed at the canvas, getting ready to hack it off into pieces. However, just as I was bringing the blade down, the woman's hand suddenly emerged from the painting and grabbed my wrist in a firm grasp. As she pushed me forward, her power was inhumane, and I let out a scream. I had the sensation that I was being drawn into the artwork, and the world around me began to fade into darkness. Now, I am unable to escape this place, which is a never-ending emptiness of shadows. In the gloom, the sound of the woman's laughing reverberates, serving as a painful reminder of my destiny. If you come across this artwork, I strongly advise you to burn it. Be careful not to let it devour you the way it did me. Because there is no way out. Once you are ensnared in its bewitching grasp, there is no way out. Story 4. It wasn't until I moved into that old farmhouse on the outskirts of town that I discovered that I had never believed in the supernatural. I was unable to pass up the opportunity since the rent was so inexpensive. It was a deal. Despite the fact that the landlord, a stern old man called Silas, had cautioned me that the location had a history, I chose to disregard his warnings. To put it simply, I was relieved to have a roof over my head. There was not much to do over the first several weeks. As I settled into my new house, I took pleasure in the tranquility and calm that the countryside had to offer. But then, the bizarre happenings started to take place. All of it began with little things. It would happen that I would discover doors that I was certain I had closed, or that lights would flicker even though the bulbs were brand new. I attributed it to the home sinking, in addition to the fact that the ancient wiring was playing games on me. However, at that moment, I started to hear the footsteps. They would reverberate down the corridors late at night, the sound of floors cracking in rooms that were vacant. The steps would become closer and closer until they halted just outside my door, at which point I would lay awake in bed with my heart hammering loudly. I made an effort to defend myself by convincing myself that it was nothing more than the wind or the house swaying. On the other hand, I had a feeling that something was awry. I was awakened by the sound of whispering throughout the night. These individuals were emanating from the ancient well located in the rear, which Silas had cautioned me from approaching at any time. When I finally made it to the window, I peered out into the pitch blackness. It was there that spectral forms might be seen congregating around the well. As the moonlight illuminated them, their bodies seemed to be transparent and flickered. It seemed as if they were chanting, with their voices rising and falling in a cadence that was sinister. While I was completely captivated, I observed as one of the individuals turned towards the home. It was a lady, and her face was contorted wildly in pain. She screamed in silence as she poked a bony finger at my window, and her lips opened at the same time. My heart was beating really fast as I staggered back from the window. I was aware that I needed to go, and I wanted to get as far away from this afflicted location as I could. My attempt to escape, however, resulted in my being unable to escape. The doors would not open, and the windows would not open, as if they were being held shut by an unseen force. Even though I was at home, I was a prisoner. The eeriness became more intense. Screams replaced the whispering, and the footsteps became a thumping sound that echoed off the walls. When I looked around, I would see the spectral people everywhere, their features distorted in anger and distress. In my search for answers, I spent a lot of time researching the history of the farmhouse. It came to my attention that in the 1800s, it had been the location of a heinous crime, in which a neighbor who harbored resentment had murdered a family. It seemed as if the ghosts were the victims, with their souls being imprisoned in the location where they had passed away. I made an effort to interact with them in order to give my assistance in seeking peace. However, they were impossible to argue with since their rage consumed them. Upon waking up on the last night, I saw that the spirits had surrounded my bed. It seemed as if their fingers were ice claws on my flesh as they reached out with their hands. I let out a scream, but I was unable to produce any sound. They dragged me out of bed and pulled me with them in the direction of the ancient well. I put up a fight, but none of my efforts were successful. In the midst of the blackness, I had a sensation of being pushed down. It is impossible for me to estimate how long I was confined there, in that chilly and wet abyss. The passage of time had lost all significance, and the world above had become a distant memory. After that, however, a hand extended itself and grabbed mine. The expression on Silas's face was one of profound grief. His strength, which was amazing for an elderly guy, was what dragged me out. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice weighed down by the weight of his sorrow. "I should have been more explicit in my warning to you. There is no way that the spirits will ever let go. I vowed to myself that I would never see that farmhouse again, but the memories continued to torment me, and the murmurs continued to reverberate in my nightmares. My advice to anybody who is thinking about renting the property is to not do so. These are the kinds of homes that should be left alone, their mysteries buried deep inside the past. For the simple reason that if you attempt to interrupt them, you can very well end up becoming a part of their terrible narrative. Story 5. The intention was for it to be a straightforward hiking excursion, a chance to escape the pressures of city life and re-establish a connection with the natural world. Jenna, my girlfriend, and I had been preparing the trip for a number of months, and we had spent a lot of time looking at maps and trail guides in order to pick the ideal path. We made the decision to go on a 3-day journey through thick woods and hard terrain, which would take us to a secluded route in the center of the Appalachian Mountains. As we made our way up the route, the leaves crunched under our boots as we headed out early on a clear autumn morning during the beginning of the season. Despite the fact that the sun was shining through the canopy in golden shafts, the air was crisp and clear. As we strolled into the bush, we marveled at the natural beauty that surrounded us and joked and spoke to one another. However, as the day progressed, there was a noticeable shift in the mood. It seemed as if the trees were getting closer, with their branches reaching out as if they were holding something. The shadows became more dense, and the sunshine gradually became a horrible gray color. Reminding ourselves that it was only our imagination playing tricks on us, we continued on with our journey. As soon as darkness fell, we relocated to a small clearing and made up camp there. We pitched our tent and built a fire to protect ourselves from the cold. We stood in close proximity to one another, the flickering flames throwing spooky shadows on the trees that were all about us. During that time, we were the first to hear the murmurs. In the beginning, they were so weak that they were hardly discernible above the sound of the fire crackling. Nevertheless, as we exerted ourselves to listen, they became louder and more forceful. It seemed as if voices were being spoken, but they were not quite human, and their words were twisted and warped. Jenna clenched her fist around my arm, her eyes widened in terror. Despite the fact that her voice was shaking, she whispered, "What is that?" I attempted to maintain my composure by shaking my head. I told myself, it's just the wind, but even with my own words, I didn't trust what I was saying. The murmurs eventually evolved into shouts as the night progressed further. They were a chorus of horror that reverberated throughout the forest, bouncing off the trees as they went. As the shouts became closer, we gathered together in our tent, our hearts thumping with intensity. In an instant, the tent started to tremble, giving the impression that someone was attempting to pull it apart. At the same time as we were frantically searching for the zipper, we yelled. We were so terrified that we stopped in place as we suddenly emerged into the clearing. A man could be seen standing there, illuminated by the smoldering glow of the fading fire. The skin was pulled tightly over its bones, and it appeared tall and emaciated on the outside. The eyes of this creature were empty holes, and its mouth was a gaping maw that was filled with sharp fangs. This creature extended its fingers, which resembled claws, towards us. We sprinted, smashing into the foliage in a state of blindness. Despite the fact that roots and branches tore at our flesh, we continued on with our journey. The thing that was following us could be heard behind us, its footsteps being heavy and sluggish. For what seemed like hours, we ran until our lungs burned and our legs hurt. Eventually, we stopped that. After what seemed like an eternity in the woods, we were finally able to emerge onto a road, and the abrupt apparition of civilization was a startling experience. As the automobile continued to pass, it came to a halt, and the driver looked at our ripped garments and crazy eyes with alarm. We fumbled our way through our narrative, pleading for assistance. Almost immediately after the driver made the contact to the authorities, the woodland was flooded with search teams and aircraft, and still, they discovered nothing. No trace of the horrible beast, and no indication that we had come into contact with it. A bear sighting, or maybe a prank gone bad, was the explanation that the authorities gave for the incident. But Jen and I were aware of the reality. No matter what we saw, we never returned to those woods, and we never discussed what we had seen. However, the recollection of that night continues to torment us, while the cries and murmurs continue to reverberate in our nightmares. I want to caution everyone who decides to go into those mountains. Exercise caution. There are animals that cannot be explained, and there are entities that sneak up on you in the darkness. You should also flee if you hear the whispering. Run away and don't turn around, because if you do, you might very well become the next person they take advantage of. Story 6. Throughout my life, I have always been captivated by the ocean, which is a huge expanse that conceals a multitude of secrets under its waves. Therefore, when I was presented with the option to participate in a deep-sea diving adventure, I did not hesitate to accept the offer. It was a dream come true, an opportunity to experience the unknown and to push the limits of what humans are capable of discovering. Dr. Evelyn Blackwell, a well-known marine scientist who is known for their willingness to undertake challenging tasks, was the one in charge of the trip. Our group was comprised of 12 specialists. Each of them brought their unique set of abilities and areas of experience to the table. We embarked on a cutting-edge research vessel that was equipped with the most recent diving equipment and a submersible that was able to submerge to the lowest depths of the ocean. It seemed as if everything was going according to plan for the first several days. We were able to successfully complete a number of dives, during which we collected samples and documented the extensive variety that exists in the deep water. However, on the 4th day, a really unfortunate event occurred. At the time, I was in the submersible with Dr. Blackwell and 2 other members of the crew when we came upon a peculiar abnormality. It was an enormous undersea construction that was so unlike from anything else that we had ever seen before. The surface of the object seemed to be engraved with complex patterns and symbols, giving the impression that it was formed of a dark metallic material. We were getting closer to the structure when we noticed that our instruments started to fail. During the communication system, the lights of the submersible flickered, and the system itself crackled with static. We were given the order by Dr. Blackwell to retreat, but it was already too late. This edifice appeared to come to life, pulsating with an uncanny energy that seemed to originate from another realm. Unexpectedly, a dazzling light filled the submersible in its whole. It seemed like my mind was being ripped apart, and I was experiencing a burning agony in my brain. After the light had gone out, I discovered that I was by myself, and the submersible was devoid of any life. I was in a state of fear as I attempted to make sense of what had occurred. My attempts to get in touch with the research vessel were unsuccessful since the communication system was down. I found myself ensnared in the depths of the water, all by myself. As the hours went by, I started to become aware of some peculiar changes appearing in my body. My eyes experienced a heightened sensitivity to even the smallest amount of light, and my complexion took on a horrible greenish tint. I had a hunger, a want for something that I was unable to precisely identify. I was aware that I needed to find a means of returning to the surface in order to alert the others about the dangers that were hiding in the depths. However, while I was guiding the submersible higher, I became aware of the genuine horror that was occurring in my predicament. There was a shift in the seas. Sea life that had been lively and colorful in the past had been replaced with species that had been twisted and altered, with their shapes being hideous and unnatural. Their eyes shone with a malicious intelligence as they crowded around the submersible they were attempting to destroy. I pushed my way through the crowds of animals, my head racing with the ramifications of what I had seen because of what I had seen. I was aware that the building that we had come upon was not of this world, and that it had in some way altered the fundamental fabric of the water itself. Upon my arrival to the surface, I discovered that the research vessel had been abandoned, and each member of the crew had disappeared without a trace. It was only me, the only person who had survived an expedition that had gone tragically wrong. I have spent years attempting to solve the enigma of what took place on that particular day, in the hopes of finding some kind of explanation for the atrocities that I saw. On the other hand, I am unable to discover the truth, because I am lost in the depths of the ocean and the caverns of my own broken psyche. To everyone who has the courage to travel into the depths, I caution you to be cautious about what you want. Something old and unknown is hiding in the shadows, and it is waiting to be discovered. And in the event that you find yourself confronted with the abyss, remember to pray that it does not look back at you. Story 7. As a child, I was always fascinated by the supernatural and otherworldly phenomena. I binge-read books on ghosts and hauntings, watched any horror movie I could get my hands on, and even participated in a few amateur ghost hunts with my friends. I was obsessed with the supernatural. When I moved into the old Victorian home on Elm Street, however, I was completely unprepared for the dread that I encounter. Nothing could have prepared me for that. The home was stunning, with elaborate woodwork and stained glass windows that projected colorful patterns on the hardwood flooring. It was a beauty. In spite of the realtor's cautions about the property's troubled history, I signed the lease on the spot because I fell in love with it the minute I laid eyes on it. There was not much to do over the first several weeks. I made myself at home in my new residence, taking pleasure in the well-appointed rooms and the peaceful surroundings. But then, the bizarre happenings started to take place. All of it began with little things. I would discover that things had been moved from where I had left them, or that doors had been left open that I was certain I had shut. Initially, I attributed it to my own forgetfulness. Nevertheless, as the weeks went by, the occurrences got more regular and their impact became more unsettling. I would wake up in the middle of the night to the sound of footsteps in the corridor, but when I went to check, I found that there was never anybody there. Occasionally, I would catch glimpses of dark people darting just out of sight, and I would hear murmurs and laughs emanating from rooms that were now unoccupied. I made an effort to decipher the situation by convincing myself that it was nothing more than my mind playing tricks on me. On the other hand, I had a feeling that something was horribly wrong. Once upon a time, I was awakened by the sound of music emanating from the vintage piano that was located in the living room. This was a music that I had never heard before, and it was eerie and eerie. Despite the fact that my pulse was hammering in my chest, I sneaked downstairs and glanced inside the room. A person could be seen there, seated quietly at the piano. The person in question was a lady, and she was wearing a long black robe that flowed down her back. Her hair was long and dark. As she moved her fingers over the keyboard with an unnatural ease, she seemed to radiate a light that seemed to come from another realm. As I stood there, utterly captivated, she turned around to face me. Her face was contorted into a horrible parody of a grin, and her eyes were dark and soulless holes. As soon as she opened her lips, a scream erupted from her throat, a sound that was intensely painful and filled with hatred. In an attempt to escape, I ran back to my room and slammed the door shut behind me again. As the cries reverberated throughout the home, I pressed myself into the corner of the room, my whole body trembling with fear. From that point on, the eerie sensation became more intense. As the footsteps became louder, the whispers transformed into shrieks, and the walls began to pound. When I was sleeping, I would feel the frigid touch of the ghostly lady on my skin. Her face would appear in mirrors and windows, and I would see her everywhere. Because I was so thirsty for answers, I investigated the history of the home. I found out that it had been the location of a terrible murder that took place in the 1920s. The victim was a young lady who was brutally murdered by her arrogant husband. It seemed as if her soul was still imprisoned inside the walls, and it would never stop seeking retribution. I made an effort to purify the home and get rid of the malicious energy that was there, but nothing was successful. The spirit was too powerful, too brimming with fury and indescribable suffering. Upon waking up on the last night, I discovered that I was immobilized, unable to move or talk on my own. Her face was just a few inches away from mine as the spectral figure hovered over me. Her chilly breath was a sensation that I could feel on my skin, and I could smell the odor of rotting that clung to her. With her lips just brushing against my ear, she leaned in close to me. As she muttered, "You're mine now," her voice sounded like the rustling of leaves that had died. Forever. I have no recollection of how I managed to get out of that home and how I was able to break free from the ghost's hold on me. I am aware, however, that I will never be the same again. The words of the ghost continue to reverberate in my head, and the memory of that night continues to torment me. I would want to say to anybody who is considering moving into that old Victorian home on Elm Street that they should not do so. There are certain locations that are designed to be left alone, with their mysteries deep inside the past. You could end up being a part of their terrible narrative, permanently stuck in a nightmare from which there is no escape, if you dare to disturb them. This is because you might just become a part of their story. Story 8. It was intended to be a straightforward camping vacation, meant to provide an opportunity to escape the pressures of regular life and take pleasure in spending time in the great outdoors. During the months that we had been planning it, my friends and I had been poring over maps and trail guides in an effort to choose the ideal location. We decided to construct our home in a distant location deep into the forest, situated a considerable distance from the closest town or ranger station. In the early hours of the morning, when we arrived at the trailhead, the sun was just beginning to make its way through the vegetation. While we were making our way further into the forest, we were conversing and joking as we carried our bags on our shoulders and headed off. The only noises that could be heard were the chirping of birds and the crunch of leaves under our feet. The air was fresh and in good condition. Strange occurrences started to come to our attention as the day progressed. It seemed as if the trees were getting closer, with their branches reaching out as if they were holding something. In spite of the fact that it was still many hours until nightfall, the shadows became longer and deeper. In addition to it, there were the sounds. Initially, we disregarded them as the typical noises that are associated with the forest, such as the rustling of leaves and the snapping of a twig. The sounds, however, got more definite and frightening as we continued to trek further into the forest. The sounds were so weak and vague that they seemed like whispers, and they came from just beyond the woods. We made an effort to dismiss it altogether, telling ourselves that it was nothing more than the wind playing tricks on us. However, when night struck and we made up camp, the whispers became more forceful and louder from that point on. It seemed as if voices were being spoken, but they were not quite human, and their words were twisted and warped. Despite our best efforts to ignore the mounting sensation of discomfort, we snuggled together around the campfire. On the other hand, we noticed the scream. A sound that could only be described as terrifying emanated from a location deep inside the forest. Our cheeks were pale as we stared at one another, and the flickering light of the fire illuminated our features. In a hushed whisper, my buddy Sarah said, "What was that?" Her voice shaking slightly. I tried to keep my own terror in control by saying, "It sounded like a person," but I also said it. "Maybe someone's hurt, lost out there in the woods." We argued on what course of action to take. It was the desire of several of us to go explore and see if we might be of assistance. Others were of the opinion that it was too risky and that we needed to remain where we were and wait until daylight. In the end, we came to the conclusion that we should remain together and take turns keeping watch throughout the night. While I was seated by the fire with my back to the tent, I was the one who took the first watch. It appeared as if the whispers were becoming louder and more urgent, as if they were trying to get my attention. I made an effort to ignore them by concentrating on the sound of the fires crackling and the gentle breathing of my companions who were trapped within the tent. Then, however, I became aware of it. A person could be seen standing there, just beyond the periphery of the firelight. The body of the creature was clothed in ragged rags, and it was tall and skinny. I was able to make out its eyes, which shone brightly in the darkness, despite the fact that its face was concealed by a cowl. My heart was racing in my chest as I could not move. The person moved closer to me by taking one step, and then another. My voice became stuck in my throat as I attempted to shout out to my pals in an effort to rouse them up. My face was touched by the apparition, which had a pale and skeletal hand that stretched out to touch me. When I yelled, it was a cry of complete and utter dread that reverberated throughout the night. The flashlights that my companions were using were able to pierce through the darkness as they emerged from the tent. On the other hand, the figure had disappeared, disappearing into the darkness, as if it had never been there in the first place. On that particular night, we made our escape from the forest by stumbling through the foliage in a state of fear. Despite the fact that our bodies were shivering with terror and tiredness, we continued on until we reached the trailhead location. No matter who we were talking to or who we were talking to, we never discussed what took place in those woods. But the recollection of that night continues to torment me, and the murmurs continue to reverberate in my nightmares. I am now aware that there are things in this world that cannot be explained, that there are horrors that lie in the shadows just beyond the limit of our comprehension. I would also want to caution anybody who wanders into those woods, or anyone who hears the voices in the night, to turn around and go back around. Before it is too late, before you become just another voice in the darkness, before you become another soul lost to the evils that lie inside you, you should decide to turn back. Story 9. It was intended to be a straightforward camping vacation, meant to provide an opportunity to escape the pressures of regular life and take pleasure in spending time in the great outdoors. During the months that we had been planning it, my friends and I had been poring over maps and trail guides in an effort to choose the ideal location. We decided to construct our home in a distant location deep into the forest, situated a considerable distance from the closest town or ranger station. In the early hours of the morning, when we arrived at the trailhead, the sun was just beginning to make its way through the vegetation. While we were making our way further into the forest, we were conversing and joking as we carried our bags on our shoulders and headed off. The only noises that could be heard were the chirping of birds and the crunch of leaves under our feet. The air was fresh and in good condition. Strange occurrences started to come to our attention as the day progressed. It seemed as if the trees were getting closer, with their branches reaching out as if they were holding something. In spite of the fact that it was still many hours until nightfall, the shadows became longer and deeper. In addition to it, there were the sounds. Initially, we disregarded them as the typical noises that are associated with the forest, such as the rustling of leaves and the snapping of a twig. The sounds, however, got more definite and frightening as we continued to trek further into the forest. The sounds were so weak and vague that they seemed like whispers, and they came from just beyond the woods. We made an effort to dismiss it altogether, telling ourselves that it was nothing more than the wind playing tricks on us. However, when night struck and we made up camp, the whispers became more forceful and louder from that point on. It seemed as if voices were being spoken, but they were not quite human, and their words were twisted and warped. Despite our best efforts to ignore the mounting sensation of discomfort, we snuggled together around the campfire. On the other hand, we noticed the scream, a sound that could only be described as terrifying, emanated from a location deep inside the forest. Our cheeks were pale as we stared at one another, and the flickering light of the fire illuminated our features. In a hushed whisper, my buddy Sarah said, "What was that?" her voice shaking slightly. I tried to keep my own terror in control by saying, "It sounded like a person," but I also said it. "Maybe someone's hurt, lost out there in the woods." We argued on what course of action to take. It was the desire of several of us to go explore and see if we might be of assistance. Others were of the opinion that it was too risky and that we needed to remain where we were and wait until daylight. In the end, we came to the conclusion that we should remain together and take turns keeping watch throughout the night. While I was seated by the fire with my back to the tent, I was the one who took the first watch. It appeared as if the whispers were becoming louder and more urgent, as if they were trying to get my attention. I made an effort to ignore them by concentrating on the sound of the fires crackling and the gentle breathing of my companions who were trapped within the tent. Then, however, I became aware of it. A person could be seen standing there, just beyond the periphery of the firelight. The body of the creature was clothed in ragged rags, and it was tall and skinny. I was able to make out its eyes, which shone brightly in the darkness, despite the fact that its face was concealed by a cowl. My heart was racing in my chest as I could not move. The person moved closer to me by taking one step, and then another. My voice became stuck in my throat as I attempted to shout out to my pals in an effort to rouse them up. My face was touched by the apparition, which had a pale and skeletal hand that stretched out to touch me. When I yelled, it was a cry of complete and utter dread that reverberated throughout the night. The flashlights that my companions were using were able to pierce through the darkness as they emerged from the tent. On the other hand, the figure had disappeared, disappearing into the darkness, as if it had never been there in the first place. On that particular night, we made our escape from the forest by stumbling through the foliage in a state of fear. Despite the fact that our bodies were shivering with terror and tiredness, we continued on until we reached the trailhead location. No matter who we were talking to or who we were talking to, we never discussed what took place in those woods. But the recollection of that night continues to torment me, and the murmurs continue to reverberate in my nightmares. I am now aware that there are things in this world that cannot be explained, that there are horrors that lie in the shadows just beyond the limit of our comprehension. I would also want to caution anybody who wanders into those woods, or anyone who hears the voices in the night, to turn around and go back around. Before it is too late, before you become just another voice in the darkness, before you become another soul lost to the evils that lie inside you, you should decide to turn back. Story 10. My fascination with the water dates back to my childhood. Its enormous size, its depths that have never been explored, and the mysteries that lie concealed under the seas. Therefore, when I was presented with the option to participate in a deep-sea diving adventure, I did not hesitate to accept the offer. It was Dr. Evelyn Blackwell, a well-known marine scientist who is known for pushing the limits of undersea research, who was in charge of leading the trip. Despite the fact that our team consisted of just a few specialists and support staff members, we were all motivated by a common interest in discovering new things. In the morning, on a bright and beautiful day, we set sail from the coast of California, where the water was peaceful and welcoming. Our sailboat was cutting edge, and it was outfitted with the most recent innovation in diving equipment, as well as safety gear. As we prepared to unearth the wonders that lied under the surface, we were filled with self-assurance and excitement. It seemed as if everything was going according to plan for the first several days. We were able to successfully complete a number of dives, during which we collected samples and documented the extensive variety that exists in the deep water. The fourth day, however, was when a peculiar occurrence took place. While we were investigating a part of the ocean bottom that had not been explored before, we stumbled upon a gigantic cavern that was located above the sea. Its walls were sleek and black, giving the impression that they were carved from obsidian. It was unlike anything that we had ever seen before. As a result of our finding, Dr. Blackwell was overjoyed. and thought that we had made a significant scientific breakthrough. With extreme caution, we made our way inside the tunnel, our torches burning brightly through the pitch blackness. It seemed as if the designs on the walls were shifting and changing right in front of our eyes. The walls were covered with odd, glowing symbols. As we proceeded farther into the tunnel, we started to experience a prickling feeling at the back of our necks, which was accompanied by a profound sense of discomfort. After then, we were able to see it. In the very heart of the cavern, there was a large mass of flesh that was throbbing continuously. The hue of it was sickening greenish, and its surface was covered with throbbing veins and tentacles that were writhing over each other. The motions of it seemed to be gradual and deliberate, and it appeared to be living and breathing. With our cameras rolling and our scientific curiosity taking precedence over our terror, we approached quietly and carefully. On the other hand, as we got closer, the monster started to transform. The tentacles of the creature swung out and wrapped themselves around our diving suits, dragging us closer to its enormous mouth. As one of my co-workers was being pulled into the mouth of the beast, I watched in horror as his cries suddenly stopped as he was being swallowed by the body of the thing. At the same time, another individual was pierced by a tentacle that was so sharp that it clouded the water around us. Despite the fact that my pulse was hammering in my chest, I was able to break free and swim madly towards the entrance of the tunnel. On the other hand, the thing was swift, and its tentacles were closing in on me from every direction. Whenever they came into contact with my flesh, I could feel their touch, which was icy and slimy. Despite the fact that my lungs were burning as I kicked my way towards the surface, I managed to escape the tunnel just in time. On the other hand, as I turned around, I saw that the beast was following me, its enormous bulk rising up from the depths like a nightmare made of flesh. Despite the fact that I was shivering with fear and tiredness, I made it back to the ship with a narrow escape. As a result of the creature's appetite, the remaining members of the crew had vanished. I was the lone person who had survived an expedition that had gone tragically wrong, and I was the only one remaining. I made an effort to warn people, to inform them about the horrors that were hiding under the waters. But nobody believed what I said. They said that I was insane and that the death of my co-workers had left me scarred. Attempts were made to persuade me that what I had seen was nothing more than a delusion, and they referred me to therapists and prescribed me medicine. But I am aware of the reality. I am aware that there are things in the water that cannot be explained, that there are monsters that remain hidden in the shadows, ready to eat each and every one of us. Additionally, I am aware that at some point in the future, they will emerge from the depths, and the whole world will stand in awe at their might. I want to caution you that if you ever find yourself pulled to the siren song of the water, if you ever feel the temptation to explore the secret depths of the ocean, you should fight the impulse. Make a U-turn before it is too late to do so, mostly due to the fact that once you have seen what is underneath, once you have stared into the abyss and felt its cold hold on your soul, you will never be the same again. Story 11. As a child, I was always fascinated by the supernatural and otherworldly phenomena. I binge-read books on ghosts and hauntings, watched any horror movie I could get my hands on, and even participated in a few amateur ghost hunts with my friends. I was obsessed with the supernatural. When I acquired the ancient farmhouse that belonged to my grandpa, however, I was immediately overcome with a sense of horror that I could not have anticipated. All of the windows of the home were boarded up, and the house itself was a large run-down edifice with peeling paint. Since my grandpa had gone away under unexplained circumstances, it had been abandoned for decades. After his death, it had been abandoned. Whenever my family did talk about him, they did it in low tones, and their eyes darted anxiously as if they were frightened of being overheard. My family seldom talked about him. In spite of this, I remained resolute in my pursuit of the truth. All of my stuff were packed away, and I moved into the ancient farmhouse, with the intention of bringing it back to its previous beautiful state. The initial impression was that everything was okay. The home was filthy and in a state of disrepair, but there was nothing about it that stood out as especially peculiar. However, after that, odd occurrences began to take place. It was the sound of footsteps creaking on the floorboards above me that would bring me up in the middle of the night. Despite the fact that I was aware that I was the only one in the home at the time, it seemed as if things would move about on their own, appearing in new areas or disappearing entirely. And then there were the rumors that circulated. When I first heard them, I thought they were just the sound of the wind blowing through the drafty hallways of the ancient home. But as the days evolved into weeks, the murmurs became more audible and different from one another. The words were jumbled and twisted, as if they were being spoken through a mouthful of water. It sounded like voices, but voices that were not quite human. My mind was playing tricks on me, so I tried to ignore them and told myself that it was simply my imagination in action. On the other hand, I saw something that caused my blood to become ice cold one night. In the midst of my efforts to go to sleep, I was laying in bed when I became aware of a gentle creaking sound emanating from the corner of the room. Despite the fact that my pulse was racing, I sat up and saw a man standing there, cloaked in darkness. The length of its limbs was excessively lengthy and wiry, and it was tall and slender. The creature then turned around to face me. Its features were warped and hideous, and its face was a mess of flesh that had been twisted. Its eyes were dark and sunken, and its mouth was a gaping maw filled with fangs that were sharp and pointed. When I heard it, it let out a deep, guttural groan, and I screamed. I sprang out of bed and ran for the door. On the other hand, the figure moved at an incredible speed. It was in the corridor when it came up to me, its hands tightening around my neck with a chilly, damp sensation. I fought against it, panting for oxygen, but its hold was too powerful for me to escape. My eyesight was becoming more blurry, and I could feel myself sliding away. After that, all of a sudden it broke me free. There was a searing sensation in my lungs as I sucked down air as I collapsed to the ground, coughing and spitting. When I glanced up, the figure was nowhere to be seen. It had disappeared into the darkness. It seemed as if it had never been there at all. In the middle of the night, I ran away from the farmhouse, leaving everything behind. I never returned, and I never mentioned what I had seen to anybody. In spite of this, the image of that horrifyingly contorted visage continues to torment me, and it can be found hiding in the furthest recesses of my mind. In an effort to discover some kind of explanation for the horrors that were hiding inside the walls of the farmhouse, I made an effort to do research on its past. However, each and every trail that I pursued, and each and every clue that I discovered, ended up leading me more into a maze of lies and secrets. When I found out that my grandpa had participated in some kind of occult ritual, I found out that it was a dark and twisted ceremony that had occurred in a way that was quite unfortunate. Something old and malevolent had been lurking in the shadows for decades, biding its time until it could take another victim. He had released something that had been waiting for generations, something that had been waiting. It would seem that I am the victim at this point. It is observing me from the shadows, waiting for the appropriate time to attack, and I can feel it. One day I am aware that it will come for me, and there will be no way for me to get away from it. In the event that you ever find yourself pulled to the ancient farmhouse on the outskirts of town, or if you ever feel the impulse to explore its secrets, I would want to caution you to refrain from doing so. Make a U-turn before it is too late to do so, because there is no turning back once you have entered that home and looked into the face of genuine evil. There is no way to back out of that situation. The whispers will follow you, the shadows will follow you, and the terrifying monster that lives behind those walls will never let you leave. It will never let you go. From the moment you take your last breath until the day you die and beyond, it will continue to torment you. Story 12. The intention was for it to be a straightforward hiking excursion, a chance to escape the pressures of regular life and re-establish a connection with the natural world. Over the course of many months, my girlfriend Sarah and I had been meticulously preparing it, thoroughly examining maps and trail guides in order to choose the ideal path. We made the decision to go on a 3-day journey over a remote section of the Appalachian Trail, which would take us through some of the most breathtaking and unspoiled terrain in the United States. We started out early on a cool fall morning, and as we made our way up the route, we could hear the leaves crunching under our boots. The sun was shining through the canopy in golden shafts, and the air was fresh and cold when it was present. As we marveled at the breathtaking scenery and the tranquility of the forest, we engaged in conversation and laughter while we were out on our stroll. On the other hand, as the day progressed, something started to feel odd. It seemed as if the trees were expanding their reach around us, with their branches reaching out as if they were holding our fingers. In spite of the fact that it was still many hours until nightfall, the shadows became longer and more profound. In addition to it, there were the sounds. Initially, we disregarded them as the typical noises that are associated with the forest, such as the rustling of leaves and the snapping of a twig. However, as we continued our journey further into the bush, the sounds got more apparent and made us feel more uneasy. The sounds were so weak and vague that they seemed like whispers, and they came from just beyond the woods. We made an effort to dismiss it altogether, telling ourselves that it was nothing more than the wind playing tricks on us. However, when night struck and we made up camp, the whispers became more forceful and louder from that point on. It seemed as if voices were being spoken, but they were not quite human, and their words were twisted and warped. I was attempting to ignore the mounting sensation of dread that Sarah and I were experiencing as we nestled close in our tent. However, as the night progressed, the whispers became into screams, which were horrifying and high-pitched, and they reverberated throughout the darkness. With our pulses hammering, we clutched to each other, unable to move or even breathe because we were too terrified. After then, we were able to see it. There was a person waiting for us just outside the boundary of our campground, which was lighted by the flickering light of our fading fire. The length of its limbs was excessively lengthy and wiry, and it was tall and slender. It had a pale and transparent skin that was tightly wrapped around its bones, giving the appearance of a corpse. Its face, as well. That is a face that I will never forget. The appearance of its characteristics was like to smoke, moving and changing as it was twisted and warped. It had dark eyes that were hollow, and its mouth was a gaping maw that was packed with fangs that were as sharp as needles. I felt my blood turn to ice in my veins as it let out a deep, guttural groan. I experienced this sensation. It was a race. The only thing we did was take off into the darkness, staggering blindly through the undergrowth. We didn't even bother to gather our equipment before we started. The monster that was following us could be heard smashing through the woods, its footsteps being heavy and ponderous. As the groans of the creature became more louder and more frantic, they eventually filled the air around us like a chorus of the damned. Our lungs were burning, and our legs were hurting as we ran for what seemed like thousands of minutes. There was no feeling of direction or purpose in our actions, and we had no clue where we were heading. We were only aware of the fact that we needed to flee, that we needed to get away from the nightmare that was pursuing us. At long last, just as the first rays of morning were beginning to appear on the horizon, we found ourselves stumbling out onto a road. Despite the fact that our faces were pale and our bodies were trembling from tiredness and fear, we raised a flag to a passing automobile. Taking a single glance at us, the driver immediately dialed the number for the police, his eyes widening in anxiety. In spite of the fact that we informed the authorities our tale, they did not believe us. After searching the forest, they could not discover any sign of the beast, or any indication of the experience that we had been through. They explained it away by saying that it was a bear sighting or even a prank that went awry. But Sarah and I were aware of the reality. No matter what we saw, we never returned to those woods, and we never discussed what we had seen. However, the recollection of that night continues to torment us, and the picture of that horrifyingly contorted face is etched so deeply into our thoughts. At this point in time, we are aware that there are things in this world that cannot be explained, monsters that lie in the shadows, ready to feed on those who are not vigilant. I want to warn you that if you ever find yourself trekking in those woods, if you ever hear the whispering in the darkness, or if you ever get a glimpse of anything moving just beyond the trees, you should immediately flee immediately. If you give in to the temptation to turn around and look behind, you might very well end up becoming the next person to fall prey to the creature that prowls the Appalachian Trail. Story 13. Paranormal phenomena, as well as the concept that there are things in this world that cannot be explained, have always been something that has captivated my attention. Consequently, when I learned that the mental facility on the outskirts of town had been abandoned, I realized that I had to conduct an investigation. A terrible past was associated with the facility, with reports of patients being mistreated and weird experiments being carried out inside its walls. Over the course of many decades, it had been abandoned and allowed to deteriorate and rot in the middle of a densely forested area. On the other hand, there were many who said that the ghosts of the patients continued to haunt the place, confined inside the deteriorating halls and the rusted metal beds. After gathering a group of friends who shared my passion for thrill-seeking and amateur ghost hunting, I decided to go on an expedition to investigate the institution on a night when there was no moon. We were prepared with spotlights, cameras, and a sick sense of curiosity, and we were excited to discover the mysteries that were concealed beneath the structure that had been completely abandoned. I started to feel uneasy as we got closer to the institution, and it continued to get more stronger. A dense covering of ivy covered the walls of the structure, which was looming in front of us with its windows obscured by darkness. The atmosphere seemed to get chillier as we got closer, and there was a chilly breeze that was blowing through the trees. We entered via a door made of corroded metal, and as we worked to push it open, the hinges made a protesting groaning sound. Each room and hallway inside the institution was more run down and unnerving than the one that came before it. The interior of the asylum was a maze. Both the walls and the flooring were covered with garbage and shattered glass, and the walls were discolored with mildew and filth. Additionally, there was a feeling that something was watching us from every direction, something that was both old and terrible. We partitioned ourselves into groups, and each of those groups went to investigate a different part of the institution. I discovered that I was in the old patient rooms, where the metal beds were still arranged in rows and the mattresses were rotting and moldy. By shining my flashlight around the room, I was able to get a glimpse of something that grabbed my attention out of the corner of my eye. It was a figure that was slumped over and contorted, with its limbs bowed at angles that were not normal. It was dressed in a ragged medical gown, and its face was concealed by a cloud of matted hair around its head. In addition, it was moving in a jerky and sluggish manner, as if it were being dragged by unseen threads. My heart was racing in my chest as I could not move. When the thing swung round to face me, I saw that its eyes were dark and hollow, and they were peering directly into my own being. I felt a surge of absolute horror rush over me as it let out a deep, guttural groan. I was completely terrified. I made a turn to flee, but the person was moving more quickly. With its fingers entwined around my neck and its breath hot and putrid on my face, it sprang at me with all its might. The grasp it had on me was too powerful, and its strength was monstrous. I strained against it. My eyesight was becoming more blurry, and I could feel myself sliding away. After that, all of a sudden, it broke me free. As I collapsed to the ground, my throat was sore and bruised, and I was gasping for oxygen. When I glanced up, the figure was nowhere to be seen. It had disappeared into the darkness. It seemed as if it had never been there at all. Although my knees were trembling and my mind was racing, I managed to stagger out of the room. I came across my buddies. All of them were pale and had big eyes because they were terrified. Furthermore, they had seen sights, heard murmurs, and experienced frigid touches in the midst of the darkness. While we were in a hurry to get away from the institution, we failed to bring our cameras and other equipment with us. In spite of the fact that we had left the institution a long time ago, the terror continued to pursue us. We were all beginning to encounter unusual occurrences, such as shadows hiding in the corners of our vision and items moving on their own without our intervention. The dreams, oh my goodness, the dreams are incredible. At night, we were tormented by thoughts of the institution, of the twisted monster that had assaulted me. These visions tortured us every night. In addition, we saw other things, including operations and experiments that were too horrifying to explain, as well as individuals wailing in anguish as they were being subjected to indescribable forms of torture. We were yelling when we awoke, our blankets soaked in perspiration, and our brains continued to be troubled by the sights that we had seen. I started looking into the history of the facility because I was really desperate for answers. My fear was further exacerbated by what I discovered. The facility had been the location of a series of terrible killings, in which both patients and staff members had been cruelly murdered by an individual who remained unknown. The perpetrator of the crime had never been apprehended, and the facility had been closed down shortly thereafter, with its secrets being buried with those of its victims. However, it seems like those secrets were coming back to haunt us at this moment. They were reaching out from beyond the grave, seeking retribution for the crimes that had been done inside those walls. The ghosts of the institution, especially the twisted creature that had assaulted me, were doing this. After what I've learned, I realized that we should never have gone to that institution, and we should never have disturbed the monsters that were sleeping there. But at this point, it is too late for us. The institution has taken possession of us and designated us as its own. I am terrified that it will come for us once again in the not-too-distant future, and this time there will be no way to get away from it. Story 14. The doll was of a little and simple kind, similar to the sort that one could discover at a thrift shop or yard sale. There was a mop of wavy blonde hair and a porcelain face that was painted with rosy cheeks and beautiful blue eyes. It also had a porcelain face. This little creature was clad in a plain blue frock, and its small hands were held together as if it were praying. The item was hidden away in a dusty corner of the attic until I discovered it at an estate auction. The home had been owned by an elderly lady for many years, and she had died away, leaving behind a lifetime's worth of materials and memories. Even though I couldn't explain why, I couldn't help but be captivated to the doll. It may have been the way that its eyes appeared to follow me around the room as I walked about, or it could have been the little anxiety that prickled at the back of my neck when I took it up. Because I was on a whim, I decided to purchase the doll because I thought it may be a good addition to my collection of antiques. After bringing it back to my house, I positioned it on a shelf in my bedroom, where it was tucked in between a row of old books and a vase filled with dried flowers. There was the first of the dreams that I experienced that night. All around me were musty boxes and cobwebs, and I found myself in a confined room that was dark and crowded. There was a slight sound of something scratching on the wood, and it sounded like something little and sharp scraping against it. Taking a peek down, I saw the doll, which had blue eyes that shone brightly in the darkness. I was watching as the doll started to move about, its painted eyes fixed on me with a stony, unyielding gaze as its head slowly rotated in my direction. The opening of its jaws revealed a row of teeth that were pointed and jagged. After then, it began to speak, its voice a stifling whisper that appeared to originate from neither one place nor any other place at the same time. As I lay in the tangled sheets of my bed, gasping for air and soaked in perspiration, Its words continued to reverberate in my head long after I had really woken up. "You're mine now," it murmured. I made an effort to reject the dream as the result of my hyperactive imagination. Nonetheless, the next night, it occurred once again. And the next, as well as the subsequent ones. The voice of the doll became more louder and more forceful with each passing moment, until it eventually filled my mind like a swarm of furious bees. Over time, I became aware of peculiar occurrences that were taking place in the home. Objects would move on their own, doors would slam shut without any prior notice, and the air would become chilly and thick, giving the impression that something invisible was watching me from the shadows that I could not see. I felt certain that it was the doll, but I was unable to articulate how or why I knew it. I made an effort to get rid of it, but each time I tossed it away or attempted to destroy it, it would resurface on my shelf the following morning, with its blue eyes shining with a satanic glow. I was so anxious for answers that I started looking into the history of the doll myself. I was surprised to learn that it had been in the possession of a little girl called Abigail, who had lived in the home where I had purchased it more than a century before. Abigail had been a distressed youngster who was prone to outbursts of fury and acts of violence. Her death occurred under unexplained circumstances after she had been committed to a mental facility, where she had been transported away. But the doll had persisted, having been handed down from generation to generation of owners, each of whom had experienced some kind of loss or tragedy. Stories were told of persons who had been driven insane by the doll's hushed voice and icy, lifeless eyes. There were even accounts of accidents and suicides. I realized that I needed to find a method to free myself from the constraints that the doll had placed on me, and to rid my house of the evil that had taken root there. Exorcisms, holy water, and even burning sage and reciting old incantations were some of the things that I did. I tried everything I could think of, but nothing was successful. Despite the passage of time, the doll continued to exist, its power increasingly getting stronger. Last but not least, in a moment of extreme desperation, I made the decision to meet the doll head-on. I took a seat in front of it, my pulse thumping in my chest, and gazed into the eyes that were painted on its face. "What do you want from me?" I inquired, my voice shaking slightly. "Why won't you leave me alone?" In my memory, the doll's voice was a sibilant whisper, and its lips twisted into a vicious grin. According to what it stated, "I want your soul," the words were oozing with hatred. "I want to experience the soothing warmth of your skin and the rhythm of your heartbeat. I would want to take a sip of your anguish and flavor your dread, and I will accept it, regardless of the circumstances." A sensation of hopelessness and misery seemed to permeate into my very bones, and I felt a chilling, creeping fear sweep over me. I believed that I was going to die. I realized at that moment that I was lost, that the doll had taken me as its own, just as it had taken so many other people before me. I am aware that there is no way out of this situation at this moment. As I sit here in the darkness of my room, the doll eyeing me from its shelf with those eyes that are icy and lifeless. In the long and violent history of the doll, I shall be relegated to the status of a mere footnote for the doll to have its way. However, it is possible that my narrative might serve as a cautionary tale to other people in some little manner. Make a break for it if you ever come across a doll that is little and modest, with eyes that are vivid blue and a porcelain face. Never turn around and go as quickly and as far as you can, and don't look back. For the reason that if you do, it may very well be the very last thing that you ever see. Story 15. My closest buddy Jack and I had been drifting away for years, and we were hoping that this journey would be a simple road trip that would allow us to reconcile with each other. We had meticulously planned the itinerary, which consisted of a gorgeous drive through the back roads of New England, with lots of stops at lovely tiny villages and roadside attractions along the way. As we filled up Jack's old, beat-up station wagon with food and supplies, we started off early on a clear fall morning. The light was just starting to peep through the trees as we made our way out toward the destination. While we were winding our way through the countryside, enjoying the magnificent reds and golds of the changing leaves, the first few hours of the journey went by without any incident. The two of us were conversing and joking as we traveled through the countryside. On the other hand, as the day progressed, the weather started to get more unfavorable. At the same time as dark clouds began to form on the horizon, a chilly wind started to blow, bearing with it the aroma of rain as well as something that was more difficult to precisely explain. A stench of rotting, of creatures that had been dead for a very long time and forgotten. In the hopes of escaping the storm and finding a spot to rest for the night, we made the decision to continue on our journey. However, as we continued to drive, the weather grew more unfavorable. When the rain began to fall in sheets, it pounded against the windshield, making it very difficult to see the road in front of you. The wind howled like an injured animal, causing the automobile to shake and sending trash and leaves soaring through the air on their way everywhere. At that moment, when we were certain that things couldn't possibly get much worse, the engine began to stutter and then stopped. As we came to a halt on the side of the road, the headlights began to flicker and fade as the battery began to run out of power. Our mobile phone service was down, and we had no means to contact anybody for assistance. We were trapped miles away from the closest town. We made the decision to wait out the storm in the vehicle, where we huddled together for warmth as the wind blew through the openings in the doors and the rain pounded down on the roof. On the other hand, as the hours passed, we started to get a feeling of discomfort, a tingling sensation at the back of our necks that indicated that we were not the only ones in the room. The only thing that we could see was the infinite expanse of woods and the empty road that stretched out behind us. We gazed out into the darkness, straining our eyes to see through the windows that were splattered with rain, but there was nothing there. Next, we were able to hear it. There was a sound that was first quite quiet, but gradually became more audible as time went on. Footsteps, slow and heavy, could be heard crunching through the bushes on the side of the road. This was the sound that was heard. Our eyes were wide with horror as we gazed at each other, and then we went back out into the darkness we had just entered. That is when we were able to see it. There was a towering and hunched figure that was making its way towards us while it was raining. The creature wore rags that were in a state of disrepair. Its skin was pale and mottled, and its eyes shone with a ferocious brightness. It walked in a jerky and unnatural manner, as if it were being pushed along by some force that was not visible to the observer. While we stood there, immobilized with fear, we watched as the figure approached us, its lips opening in a scream that was completely quiet. At that moment, just as it was about to approach the vehicle, it disappeared, vanishing into the darkness with the same suddenness with which it had emerged. While we sat there, our hearts were hammering fiercely in our chests, and we were shivering and gasping for air. After then, we heard the sound once again, this time coming from the other side of the vehicle, and it was much louder than before. As we cautiously turned around, hardly daring to take a breath, we saw another figure, then another and another, all of them stumbling towards us through the rain, their eyes glimmering with the same wild brightness. The sound of our screams, which were a sound of unadulterated primitive dread, tore from our throats and reverberated throughout the night. We were so frantic to get out that we clawed at the doors that they would not move, as if they were being kept in place by an invisible power. And still, the figures continued to approach, their hands reaching out and their fingers wrapping around the panes, leaving behind a trail of a black, sticky material in their wake. And then, just as abruptly as it had started, it was ended without any warning. With the disappearance of the figures, the rain stopped falling, and the wind slowed down to a soft breeze. While we were sitting there, huddled together in the darkness, our breath came out in ragged gasps, and our thoughts were whirling from the horror of what we had just seen. There was never another time that Jack and I brought up that night. After that, we went our own ways, each of us making an effort to forget the terrifying experience that we had endured on that alone stretch of road. However, there are moments when I find myself going back to that moment, to the sight of those shambling figures and the sound of their footsteps crunching through the undergrowth. This occurs when the night is dark, when the wind is howling, and when the rain is hammering down. I wonder, with a sensation of dread that is creeping up on me, whether they are still out there somewhere, waiting for another traveler who is unaware of their presence to stumble over their route, waiting to take them down into the darkness and make them one of their own. Story 16. The thought that there are endless copies of ourselves living different lives in various worlds has always been one that has captivated me. Parallel universes are a concept that has always amazed me. On the other hand, I never in my wildest dreams thought that I would see one of those other selves in person, much alone that the experience would be so scary. A peculiar dream, in which I saw a universe that was like to my own, yet slightly different, was the beginning of everything. I had a dream in which I was traveling along a street that I was acquainted with, but the buildings, the facades of which were twisted and deformed like something out of a funhouse mirror, were all incorrect. Suddenly, I caught a glimpse of her, my doppelganger, looking back at me from the other side of the street with a grin that was both recognizable and completely bizarre. My heart was racing in my chest as I awoke with a jolt, but I instantly disregarded the dream as nothing more than the result of my hyperactive imagination coming to life. However, after a few days had passed, I eventually came face to face with her once again, this time in the light of day. My eyes got a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye as I was heading home from work through the park. It was my typical route through the park. A runner or a dog walker was what I was anticipating seeing as I turned around, but instead, I found myself gazing at my own face. It was impossible to tell the difference between her and myself in any manner, from the clothing she wore to the way she carried herself about. My teeth were on edge and my skin crawled because of something about her that I couldn't quite put my finger on. Her grin was a bit too big and a little too harsh, and her eyes were quite cold and lifeless. She approached me with fluid and elegant motions that were almost otherworldly. I remained there, paralyzed in astonishment as she neared me. Her head was tilted to the side, and her eyes were fixed on mine as she came to a halt only a few feet away. She came up to me and said, "Hello, Sarah," with a tone that was an exact repetition of mine. "I've been waiting for you." My tongue felt thick and heavy in my mouth, and my words stuck in my throat as I attempted to speak. I wanted to ask her who she was and what she'd want, but I was unable to do so. She did nothing more than grin, a smile that was entirely composed of teeth, and without any expression of warmth. And then she reached out with one cold hand to touch my face. I wrenched away, staggering backwards, and my heart was pounding in my chest during the whole process. She laughed, a sound that was both beautiful and dreadful, and then she was gone, disappearing into the shadows as if she had never been there at all. Her laughter was a sound that captured both beauty and horror. I made an effort to persuade myself that all that had happened was a hallucination, a trick of the light, or a feeling that was brought on by stress. But I was aware of the reality of the situation. It was true that she existed, and she was standing somewhere in the world waiting for me. Trying to figure out who she was and why she had entered my life became a preoccupation of mine, and I became fascinated with locating her. While I was seeking for any piece of knowledge that would assist me in making sense of what was going on with me, I spent a significant amount of time online doing research on doppelgangers and parallel worlds. After that, she returned to me at some point throughout the night. My eyes sparkled in the darkness as she stood at the foot of my bed, her grin piercing and menacing. I awoke to see her standing there. I felt a burst of power that was both exciting and horrifying go through my body as she stretched out to me and her fingertips lightly touched my skin. I felt a bolt of lightning race through my body. When she said, "Come with me," her voice was like a siren song, and I was unable to resist answering her call. Come and see what you could be, what you could have. Then, I followed her out of my room and into the night, my feet moving of their own accord, my thoughts lost in a haze of dread and intrigue. I was a terrified and fascinated person, until we arrived to a location that I had never seen before, a location that seemed to exist outside of time and space. She led me through the streets, down alleyways, and over bridges until we arrived at another location. It was a realm of shadows and mist, constructed with structures that were twisted and geometries that were inconceivable. A throne, a seat of authority that appeared to pulse with an unearthly force, was perched in the middle of all that was going on. Her eyes flashed with a dark and awful brightness as she took her seat upon the throne before her, and then she spoke, her voice reverberating through the abyss. And suddenly, my mind was filled with thoughts of a universe that was beyond anything I could have ever imagined. She smiled as she extended her hand to me, a promise of power and grandeur. "Join me," she said. "Take your place by my side, and together we will rule over all the worlds that ever were or ever will be." Due to the ramifications of what she was saying, I hesitated, and my mind was racing with thoughts. In the end, however, I was aware that I did not have any other option. My fingers felt the cold, lifeless skin under them as I reached out and grasped her hand. I then allowed her to draw me into her embrace. I am now bewildered and ensnared in a world that is both familiar and completely foreign to me. It is a universe in which I am both myself and someone else totally. As I make my way through the streets of this peculiar and dreadful location, my eyes look for a means to return to the life that I used to know. But I am aware that there is no way out of this situation, due to the fact that I am now the doppelganger, the shadowy mirror of the person I used to be before to this. I must accept the darkness and allow it to completely engulf me until there is nothing left of the girl I used to be, nothing but a recollection of a life that never actually lived at all. This is the only way to go ahead. Story 17. A flea market or a garage sale could be a good place to look for a box like this one, which was rather modest and inconspicuous. The clasp that held it closed was made of tarnished metal, and it was made of dark wood that had been polished. Along the sides, there were beautiful carvings. The item was coated in a coating of dust and cobwebs when I discovered it, which was hidden away in the back of an old antique shop. There was no particular reason that pulled me to the box. Nonetheless, as soon as I laid eyes on it, I knew that I had to have it. At first, the proprietor of the business, an elderly gentleman with a white beard that was a wispy and blue eyes that were piercing, was hesitant to sell it to me. He cautioned me that the box had a history, that it had been in the possession of a number of different people throughout the course of its existence, and that none of its prior owners had been successful. However, I was a young and naive person, and I did not pay attention to his warnings. I made the purchase and brought the box back to my house, excited to uncover its mysteries and find out what riches it may really contain. For a while, it seemed as if the box was devoid of any contents. It was only a simple wooden container. However, when I looked at it more attentively, I discovered that there was a little keyhole concealed from view behind the brass clasp. I examined the box for a key, but I was unable to find any. As a result, I decided to put the box away, considering the possibility that I might never find out what it contained. However, when I was lying in bed that night, I became aware of a noise emanating from the box. The sound was a gentle and musical tinkling, similar to the chiming of very little bells. When I got up and went to inspect, I saw that the keyhole was emitting a dim, spooky light. As I came closer to the box, I noticed that the light was not very bright. I stretched out to touch it, and as my fingertips made contact with the cold metal, I experienced a surge of electricity that coursed through my whole body. I was taken aback when the box suddenly opened, and I found myself looking down at a little wooden figure that had been carefully carved over. At the very least, it had the overall appearance of a guy. It was a man. There was something about it that made my skin crawl and my heart beat, yet there was also something that was odd about it. At the same time as its lips was contorted into a vicious and mocking smile, its eyes were dark and dead. And as I was watching, it started to move, its limbs jerking and twitching as if they were being pulled by threads that I could not see. I made an effort to seal the box, to conceal the figure, and to act as if I had never seen it before. It was, however, too late. I was already under the influence of the figure, and its ominous enchantment was beginning to seep into both my head and my soul. It was at that very time that my life started to fall apart. I began experiencing bizarre nightmares, glimpses of a dark and twisted universe where the figure was the most powerful person in the planet. When I would wake up in the middle of the night, my sheets would be soaked in perspiration, and my heart would be hammering deeply in my chest. After then, the accidents began to take place once more. Initially, I had very minor setbacks, such as stumbling over my own feet or losing a drink. Then, however, they quickly got more severe. There were times when I would find myself standing at the top of a towering structure, with no recollection of how I had arrived there. Other times, I would wake up behind the wheel of my vehicle, a significant distance from my house, with no clue where I was headed. I was aware that the figure was the one responsible for everything, and that it was using me as a puppet in order to fulfill its warped and sinister inclinations. However, I was unable to put a stop to it, and I was helpless in the face of the evil power that it had. In an effort to get rid of the box, I attempted to either destroy it or toss it away. However, each time I did so, it would resurface in my room, and the person that was within would smile at me with those eyes that were completely dead and black. After that, I awoke one morning to find myself standing over the corpse of my best buddy, a bloodied knife in my hand. I was standing over the body of my friend. I had no recollection of what had transpired, and I had no clue how I had arrived at that location. I was aware with a horrible certainty that the figure had compelled me to carry out the malicious purpose that it had in mind, and that it had used me to carry out its plans. During that time, I ran away, trying to escape the authorities as well as the horror of what I had done. On the other hand, the box followed me wherever I went, and the person that was sitting inside of it whispered its sinister promises into my ear. I am aware that there is no way out of this situation at this moment, as I sit here in this dirty hotel room with the box sitting on the table in front of me. My identity has been taken over by the figure, and it has no intention of letting go of me. Even at this moment, I am aware that it is observing me. Its dark eyes are penetrating my very being. And I am well aware that it will soon cause me to act in a manner that is much more heinous, something that will sentence me for all eternity. But it's possible that, in some perverse manner, it is exactly what I deserve. I was the one who brought the box into my life, the one who let its black power loose on the world. I was the one who brought it into my life. As a result of my ignorance, my arrogance, and my greed, I am now required to bear the consequences. As a result, I am now seated here, anticipating the conclusion, well aware that the figure will inevitably make its last motions sometime in the near future. And when that time comes, I will be prepared to welcome the darkness and allow it to engulf me totally, both physically and spiritually. Because, in the end, there is no way to get away from the curse of the box, and there is no way to get away from the evil that is contained inside. Surrender is the only option, along with the realization that, in the end, we are all nothing more than pieces in a game that we will never have it in our power to win.